that time I had been listening to a lot of podcasts, just like this one, and two things stood out to me at that time. One was a podcast between Joe Rogan and Elon Musk. And it's not about the content per se. Is during the podcast, Elon Musk famously and popularly smoked cannabis and probably other drugs on the show with Joe Rogan. And then he subsequently made the claim that he does it all the time at the workplace, smoking weed and other substances, because he believed that doing so make him more creative. And I had this idea that, he's Elon Musk, the richest person in the world, very smart, very famous. Is he right about that, right? Or if he's right, is it applicable, is it generalizable to the general population? So I talking to this idea, this podcast, sharing this along with my colleagues, and one colleague specifically in the U.S. at that time in Seattle, Washington. Really we talk about it. We just hit it off, and I had this idea about running a study, a true RCT, randomized control trial, to assign some individuals to consume cannabis and some to not consume cannabis in a waiting room, and just test their creativity after either they have consumed or not consumed cannabis.
So, today's guest is Professor Sam, Professor of Business Administration and Head of Department of Management and Organization at National University of Singapore. Professor Sam is one of the leading global researchers exploring the future of work, human-robot interaction, business ethics, and leadership. His studies have been featured in top journals like Economist, Harvard Business Review, and Scientific American. What's fascinating about his work is how it blends psychology and management and exploring what happens when human and technology collide at work. So, thank you so much, Professor, for joining me today and sharing your wisdom with all of us today at Clearly Lecture.
Great to be here.
So I'm excited to have this conversation with you. And the first thing, as you mentioned in your introduction as well, your research work in AI. So a lot of students today think that AI will take over their jobs and it will reshape the job market. You have worked and published a paper on how robots and AI at work blend together and how it impacts the job industry. So if possible, can you share your words on that?
Sure. So that paper was published in 2023. Some of the listener would know research take a very, very, very long time. So that project was started in approximately 2019, 2020. So what I'm about to say, this is at least dated 5 years ago, right? Based on data about 2020, 5 years ago. In that paper, unlike the recent trends, unlike the recent pundits have been talking about forecasting, we actually find that across nation, across cities, um, AI is not doing that much to affect and disrupt the labor market. Meaning that in cities or in countries where AI and robotics are really advanced, we don't see a correspondent increase in unemployment rate. We don't see a decrease or increase. We just see no change whatsoever. That being said, like I said, I want to emphasize one more time. This is based on data about 5 years ago. That's certainly pre-ChatGPT, pre the recent AI boom. We have not done a follow up precisely because data are hard to combine. They typically lack the market. If I were to do it today, I would not be surprised to see a small decrease in terms of employment as a function of AI. But my prediction, my forecast is that the decrease in employment would be smaller than what people have been listening to the media for a couple of reasons. The first is that people typically focus on job loss and negative events in general. They are not too attuned to job gains as a function of AI. So, for instance, in economics research, in psychology research, we typically see that when new technology comes about, they disrupt some old jobs that we know very, very well of. What we are less certain and less sure about is that we don't know there are new jobs and positions that will be created as a function of these new technologies. So that's one thing. The other thing is simply a bias in reporting that news media teach a class in the MIM program about decision making, and we have learned in class that typically negativity sells a lot better than positivity. If we were to say that, Amazon, for example, last week cut 14,000 jobs, that is going to be well reported in the news cycle for the next 48 hours. If you were to say that some other companies, which is absolutely true, social services and healthcare has gained a lot of positions in the same time period, people typically ignore that, doesn't really sell very well. So by and large, if you look at current data, we don't see a strong uptick in unemployment because we are ignoring these two parallel points that is helping employment.
Very well summarized. And as you mentioned about the topic of how people look negative images more frequently and focus on that more, can you explain this phenomena with all the people listening it today?
Sure. This started with a very, very well known theory called prospect theory that was first developed in the 70s and 80s by a very, very, very famous economist called Daniel Kahneman. He was a Nobel laureate in the mid 2000s. Unfortunately, passed away a couple of years ago. So he has this really famous theory that basically suggests that loss aversion is very true. That people would rather not lose something than to gain the same proportion of that particular thing. So a good example would be if you invest in the stock market, losing $100 feel way more sad and significant compared to gaining $100 or even $200. So that's loss aversion. And that theory, this phenomenon has been used to explain many, many things, including why social media and mainstream media typically are more attuned and report negative events because negativity typically goes more viral than positivity. And one major thing that these days people seem to optimize in social media is negative, immoral behavior and stories of other people, right? So things that cause moral outrage typically goes the most viral. If you think about political disagreement, that's typically um, there's some immorality implied in those disagreement. If you think about social media story about certain things, certain event that happen, there's typically a morality component in it.
And as you were even teaching in the class about ethics and morality, people do focus on the negative elements a lot. And I have a similar question based on this ethics and morality. I'm a big sports lover, and I wanted to get your take on ethical negotiation when it happens between a team and a player, because there's a lot of transfers around the team, and the player move from one team to another just for the paycheck or something other. So, do you think there's an ethical edge in this transaction?
Not really. I'm also a sports fan, specifically in basketball. So in I don't know about baseball, football, other sport that well. In basketball, there's a transfer window, just like most sports, and typically within the last, I would say, 1 day or 48 hours, that's where the action really happened, the negotiation, and typically players get very short notice. There's one case in which I remember that one player actually was notified that he was traded um, during the break between the quarters, right? And then as a professional who was being highly compensated, he took it professionally. I'm sure there's some unhappiness, but I don't see any ethical violation in that regard. That being said, if the listener who is paying attention to the basketball world, as last week there was a really big scandal involving illegal gambling by some current and former basketball players. That to me is a very black and white thing. That players and coaches certainly should not be gambling when they're still active in their playing or coaching career.
I guess there's a lot of scandals in India as well, where there's involvement of gambling during a cricket match. And there was even ban on cricket teams for a while. And after that, they came back for approximately like 4 or 5 years.
Mhm.
So, do you think an active player should, based on his performance, should gamble? Because it's available in boxing and in UFC where they can gamble on themselves and earn money from that. So, is it ethically right?
Again, I don't know enough in this sport to
Okay.
comment, but from a casual layperson perspective, if you can gamble on yourself, I see there's a huge conflict of interest, and I would be very cautious against that. In fact, I would say in general, gambling in sports. Certainly, there's online gambling industry that's trying very hard to promote that. And some countries have legalized or even encouraged sports gambling because of the financial result. I do worry how that would change the nature of sports, even for those who are not gambling, right? If you think about the NBA, the National Basketball Association, about 10 years ago, they're very, very hard and very much against any kind of gambling. The new commissioner, the relatively new commissioner, he's the first one to publicly say that we should openly accept gambling to the NBA because doing so can bring the league to an even higher position, which I'm certainly is true financially, but does it affect the intrinsic value of the sport? I do have reservations.
So there was a research paper that you have written in, and it was published in the Harvard Business Review, where you mentioned that humor can even backfire during a work time. So what inspired you for this research? And do you think when a student or young professional enters into this corporate work, should use humor effectively in their workplaces? Or yeah, I want your take on that if possible.
Sure. So that paper was done almost a decade ago, but I remember very clearly. It started because I was reading another paper about humor in the workplace, and that paper was trying to explain what makes a joke funny, right? If I ask you this question, you would be able to answer what you find to be funny, but it's really hard to explain what components of a joke that makes the joke funny. The academic was a marketing professor. He had this theory that he argued that jokes have to be funny only if they have violate a norm. In other words, there's no benign jokes. If everything is benign, it cannot be funny. It must violate a norm in order to be funny. Now, you may find it funny, but non offensive. But for that joke to be funny, it has to offend someone. So, for instance, the two of us here, we are both gentlemen. We can, I'm not saying we're going to do this, but suppose you make a joke about the ladies. We will find it funny because it violates a norm about ladies. They will not find it funny, right? So for any kind of jokes, in our research, we find that there's basically no harmless joke. It's always harming someone, even psychologically, somewhere, somehow. And that's why we find it funny. And in that particular paper, we find that when leaders use joke all the time, even though those jokes are perceived to be funny and non-offensive to the in-group, they are funny for a reason because it harms psychologically or materially to the outgroup. We find that when leaders keep joking in the workplace, the followers slowly perceive that violating norms, violating rules is considered to be okay and legitimate in the workplace. And that gradually transmits to an increased tolerance of unethicality and deviance in the workplace. At the same time, however, we also know the positive effect of jokes, right? So if you have a leader who likes to joke around in a mostly benign way, you feel more satisfied with the leader, you like the leader more, you may even work harder under that particular leader. So in that paper, we are one of the first that demonstrate that in between positive humor and negative humor like harassment, there's this middle gray space that exists that for some leaders, it can actually enhance performance. On the other hand, they have to be aware that if you joke around all the time, your followers slowly realize that this workplace is fun, not so serious, and in turn, trying to push the boundary for illicit behavior.
So is it just applicable for the leaders or even for the people who are just entering and they just use humor as a way to please the person?
That's a fantastic question. So in that paper, we basically observed that it is only about leaders. So leaders have a unique role in society, in organization, in that whatever they say, whatever they act, is served as a norm. Whereas if you're just coworkers, if you joke around, the coworkers' behavior do not usually lead to a norm building consensus. So if a coworker is joking around, you don't see that as acceptable because it's just a coworker. When a leader engaging in the same behavior, you see that as norm setting behavior.
Okay, so this research paper was more like norm setting and how a person who is leading the way through the company is gonna personify the image of the brand and how it would impact the brand and
That's
the
correct.
followers. Okay, interesting topic. And one of the most interesting topic that I really wanted to have a word with you when I was having a word with my friends that I'm interviewing you. So they even asked me to ask you this question. So you have studied about this unconventional topic of the role of cannabis in enhancing creativity, something that definitely sparks curiosity among the students.
Sure.
So what were your key takeaways from this research, and how do you connect it in the broader discussion about creativity at work?
That's a very good question. And we are in Singapore. So I just want to say that I strongly discourage anyone who want to experiment on cannabis, any kind of drug. So that paper started in 2021 during COVID. So just like most people, we all suffered to some extent during COVID. And at that time, I was in a hard spot psychologically because I'm a social person, and COVID really prohibited me from being social. So I started to think about and work on different research topic. And one thing that really excited me is at
So
that time I had been listening to a lot of podcasts, just like this one. And two things stood out to me at that time. One was a podcast between Joe Rogan and Elon Musk. And it's not about the content per se. Is during the podcast, Elon Musk famously and popularly smoked cannabis and probably other drugs on the show with Joe Rogan. And then he subsequently made the claim that he does it all the time at the workplace, smoking weed and other substances, because he believed that doing so make him more creative. And I had this idea that, he's Elon Musk, the richest person in the world, very smart, very famous. Is he right about that, right? Or if he's right, is it applicable? Is it generalizable to the general population? So I was talking to this idea, this podcast, sharing this along with my colleagues, and one colleague specifically in the U.S. at that time in Seattle, Washington. Really we talk about it. We just hit it off, and I had this idea about running a study, a true RCT, randomized control trial, to assign some individuals to consume cannabis and some to not consume cannabis in a waiting room, and just test their creativity after either they have consumed or not consumed cannabis. So this was done in Seattle, Washington, which is entirely legal. Consuming cannabis for recreational purposes is entirely legalized. Not done in Singapore, so we follow every single rules. Moreover, we also apply for the ethics approval necessary at both institutions, meaning that the universities in Seattle as well as in the US have approved this study. And in this study, we basically look at a few outcomes. So of course, the most important thing is creative output. Do these individuals, after smoking cannabis, do they become more creative, as rated by third parties? We also measure two other relevant outcomes. The first is the self-rating of creativity. Do they themselves believe that they're more creative or less creative? And the third outcome, which is how would they evaluate other people's creativity? You think about in the workplace, if you're a middle manager, the subordinate come with you with ideas, you have to evaluate those ideas, their merit, their creativity. If you're not accurate in that, that will lead to trouble. So we have three findings because we have three dependent variables. So first, we find that in general, when people consume cannabis or weed, they report themselves as being more creative. However, as rated by third party, they're no more or no less creative. So in other words, subjectively, they believe they're more creative. Objectively, they are no worse or no better in creativity. Now, the third outcome, do they actually rate others' creative ideas to be higher, lower, or similar in creativity? We find that under the influence of cannabis, people in general find all ideas to be creative. They see butterflies in the world. They are not discriminatory or bad ideas. So we have two conclusions in this study. So first is that if your workforce, if your followers, if your team members are smoking weed when they do their creative tasks, it will not harm their performance. It will not help them, but it will not harm them. It will make them feel even better about themselves because they see themselves as being better, although it's most likely a subjective bias. But more worrying is that if you're a leader like Elon Musk, if you use cannabis when you evaluate your subordinate, your team's idea, you will likely be biased in favor of ideas that are not very good because you're under the influence of cannabis. So in general, we don't find a positive effect. We typically find a effect that's biasing leaders to think of all ideas as being good and creative, which is not good for organization.
So it's more about release of happiness. Something that's released from your blood creates more happy and more vibrant mood around you. So maybe that's the reason that's giving the person who's the leader, making them believe that everything around them is being more creative and something like that.
Probably
Or
dopamine, that's what you're referring to. It's a
okay,
neurochemical that makes you happy. Certainly, when you smoke cannabis, it certainly is affecting you neurologically speaking. And that's certainly one of the many possible ways why we lead to such biases. We never measure that, of course, these neurotransmitters, but it's very, very much possible.
as you mentioned about dopamine, so in the world of social media, there's always a dopamine release when you are actively going through this apps and going through the profile of everyone. So do you believe that there could be side effects of that, especially in a working environment? The more you use the social media apps and
Oh, 100%. So the idea is that um, as human beings, we seek positivity, like we mentioned earlier. And the idea that dopamine induced positivity is very addictive, right? If you think about social media apps, you get a push notification, you want to see what it is, you want to see if someone likes your IG post or whatever. And I think one of the immediate downside is that, as I observed in my teaching career, 10 years ago when I first started, social media was very big already, but certainly not as big as today. And certainly there were fewer platforms than today, right? And 10 years ago, I see students as being more attentive than students in 2025. Presumably because they have so many temptation of social media platforms and these devices, these apps, these companies, they master the craft to grab your attention. It's an attention economy, right? And if you're a student, unfortunately, that would means that you would have divided attention even in the classroom. And that's not great for learning purposes, for example. And in the workplace, I would imagine that that would be highly distracting to a productive workforce and productive.
so should any company or even the schools or universities should introduce any policies to restrict the number of usage or number of hours that a person is using the social media app in the future to improve as like yeah, it's an individual opinion of yours. So
That, that's a
yeah.
great question. So in the workplace, I think is exceedingly difficult to enforce that, at least in Singapore, in America, in most of the world. In schools, I think many schools have already made moves to constrain social media usage, even governments. Look at Australian government, I think starting January, they are requiring social media company to do better age gating, right? You have to be 16 to get an account on certain platforms. And there are some schools in the US and some RCT done already in both India and the US, showing that schools and students who are not using social media or their phones during the school day, they do report better performance, school performance in this case. However, the gain in school performance typically is small in size, right? So while that's not definitive yet because we need more studies, so far the evidence suggests that there's some positive gains of not using social media on your phone during the school day, especially for a younger population.
So, as a student, I want to know more about like how did you started your journey in this research field, and how did you come up with the idea that I want to go into the field of psychology and pursue this field of.
That's a great question. So I mentioned in the first day of class that is really, really random. I never wanted to or planned to go abroad to study in the US. So what happened was that when I was high school, um, one of my friends in my high school commit a serious offense, crime, and then my parents freak out and they sent me abroad for a high school exchange program. It's meant for 1 year, but then it turned into a 10-year, 1 decade journey for me. And I started in psychology, and I had the fortune to have many, many good mentors, and one of which advised me to go to business school to pursue my PhD, which I did. And I did 4 years of my PhD and really enjoyed research during that 4 years. And that's how I started in my journey from a psychologist to a business, I would say, applied psychologist. looking at psychological issues and problems at the individual level among employees and consumers. So I joined NUS 10 years ago. It's a fantastic institution, offered me a lot of support to do my research and really enjoy what I've been doing. And this is how I got to where I am today.
So do you enjoy this applied psychology thing that you are pursuing right now, or the research work you enjoy that more?
I think both. I think this is a virtuous cycle, right? So in the business school, unlike in the psychology department, in a business school, we can work on real world problem. We can work on actual project with actual organizations. So for instance, some of the early work on robotics that I've been doing, I work with this hotel in Japan. They are one of the first hotel that automate services. So working with this hotel, consulting with them, makes me realize that research in my discipline has many actual real implications. And by talking to these hotels and delivering not just research with them, but also educational program, that makes me really, really satisfied with my academic pursuit. And I would say that if I were staying in psychology, perhaps I would do more basic research, looking at very basic scientific pattern that may not be applicable immediately to the real world. Whereas in the business school, I can do applied research that I can see immediate practical impact in the actual organization.
Is there any specification for type of group who should pursue psychology as a curriculum? Because if you are more introvert or an extrovert, is there anything that you have come across in your journey when you're
I
pursuing?
don't think personality is a big determinant. I think one of the biggest thing is some sort of innovation, right? So if you're an innovative person, because research is a very much a creative endeavor and professional, you have to be somewhat creative to see patterns between the predictor and the outcome variable. So being original, being at least somewhat innovative is very important. The other thing is, I would say independence, right? In the research world, you have an advisor, but your advisor will not be telling you exactly what to do. His job, her job is to advise you to do things. So that's very important. As you transition into a junior faculty position, is even worse. You have no mentor, no advisor. You have 6, 7 years to make a name for yourself, right? So this career is highly, highly independent. You have to be an independent person, be comfortable in doing that. If you need structure, if you need a 9 to 5 kind of thing, this will not be a good profession for you to pursue.
So, so there would be a lot of times when you were struggling and you would be requiring like self motivation to pursue this thing.
Exactly.
Uh,
Unlike a 9 to 5 job, if you don't deliver, let's say on Monday and Tuesday, by Wednesday your boss can come to you and say, "Hey, what's the delayed?" Whereas in academia, if you don't deliver for 6 months, nobody knows, right? But at the end, you suffer the consequence. So you have to be highly independent. You have to be high in self control and goal setting to be successful in this career.
And recently in our class, you called a guest lecturer from McKinsey, and it made me realize how important judgment and decision making are in the consulting and leadership world. So, what advice would you like to give students who want to build a strong decision making skills in the field of consultancy or a similar career path?
So I think one important thing is that in NUS Business School, we offer not just my class, but a few other classes on decision making and judgment. So a very easy low hanging fruit is that if you're still pursuing a master's, take those classes. Offers elective or core classes in your program. Number one thing. Number two thing is that these days education is so democratized that you can go to different platform and take similar and shorter classes. Right, Khan Academy we spoke about earlier, other platforms, Coursera, for example, offer very similar classes. The third thing is that if you still think that is too long, right? One semester class at NUS is too long. A 5 hour class at Coursera is too long. There are books available, even like podcasts available on decision making and judgment. So one podcast I really like I think it's been 20 years already. When I was an undergraduate student, I started reading this book called Economics. It's a behavioral economics popular textbook that's written by a very famous economist at Chicago. And then he and his collaborators started about 2 decades ago this podcast channel that's highly, highly subscribed to, which I listen to regularly even to these days. So these are many, many resources available for student like yourself in your early 20s to sharpen your decision making skill set. And NUS Business School, if you're like 45-year-old, you don't have time to take a 13-week class. We offer a lot of non-degree, 5 days, 3 days training, specific on decision making, which I've been involved in as well.
Do you think any specific concept that you like to recommend to any person that where a person should work on in order to become a better decision maker?
Yeah, if I can distill to just one thing, there's certainly many things, but one thing that I think is especially important for leaders and employees alike is the importance of causal logic, causality, right? Um, Most lay people don't think about causal logic very, very carefully. Academics, on the other hand, we take causality very seriously. So in many, many daily conversation, we make causal arguments. We say doing X makes me feel Y, right? In academic training, we try very hard to ensure that X is in fact causing Y. So to give you one example, um, if you think that going to a fantastic institution would make you a you know, give you a better career financially speaking, right? That's making a causal argument saying that going to school X makes you a higher salary employee at a later time. And one famous logic and thinking is this a selection effect or is it like a treatment effect? Because in this argument, we implies a treatment effect that the school in that 4 or 3 years is causing you to become a smarter person. As a result, the labor market will value your skill set and pay you more. A easier and more equally intuitive logic is that present selection effect, that these fancy institutions are selecting the very best student to begin with. Regardless of the treatment in 3 or 4 years, they will still become very smart and highly valued commodities in the labor market. So academics will think about these things very, very carefully, but most lay people don't think about causality very carefully. And in turn, they make judgment that may not be accurate. To offer one final example um, about medicine, right? Which happened to us, I would say, once a year. We get a call. The immediate instinct for us to do is to see a doctor, typically a GP. And a GP would offer you certain medications to make sure that you are getting better and better. And we associate that with seeing a doctor when we get a cold to getting better in 3 days. There's a very intuitive, some would say educated association that seeing a doctor causes us to become better in 3 days. When in reality, research shows very clearly in scientific research, medicine research, that most cold or whatever condition that you have is caused by viruses, right? Viruses typically die in 3 to 5 days, regardless of what you take. In fact, the medication that is prescribed to you do not kill those viruses. It merely makes the symptoms better. Meaning that the counterfactual is that if you don't see a doctor in 3 to 5 days, you become better anyway in 95% of the cases. So think about causality very carefully and avoid a lot of mishap in your regular.
And could it be related to if we want to relate placebo effect into the causality? So is there any way you can explain that with your research?
Certainly, certainly. So in most good research, RCT again, randomized control trial, the control group typically gets some sort of treatment. In medical research, typically get a sugar pill that they think is an actual pill. In psychological research, we don't have pills per se. We give them a corresponding intervention. So, for instance, if you think that certain training program would make employee become more productive, we will have a corresponding training program that's just placebo, that's not teaching them any skill set that we think is important as a control group. So certainly placebo effect is very, very relevant in decision making and judgment.
Okay, that's interesting. And as we have talked about a lot of biases, one of my favorite biases from the class was status quo biases. I think many of us experience it without even realizing. And could you share how we can become more aware of these biases in our daily decision making?
Sure. So in my class, if I share with the students, is that you got to think about what is the default, right? also called default bias, status quo bias, kind of the same thing. The rule of thumb to me is that if the default is set by a third party, specifically a for-profit third party, the default typically is not a very good default for you. Typically, it's a very good default for them, right? Conversely, if the default is set by a benevolent authority, so typically a government, maybe a university, although you can argue private versus public school, they have different incentives. If you think about who set a default, you can immediately infer whether the default is good or bad for you.
If you can explain this with an example of what's the common default biases that's been used and we just ignore them. And I guess I've read about the credit card bias. That's very common. But if you can elaborate using it in an example, that would be great.
Of course, the most famous one, arguably the most famous one, is Google and Apple, the iPhone, right? So Google every year pay a lot of money to Apple so that Google is used as a default browser on any single new iPhone that they produce. And I'm not saying that Google Chrome is a bad search engine or platform. In fact, I use it, right? What they have realized is that if you buy a new iPhone, there's pre-installed apps, including the browser. What they find is that virtually nobody would install a second or a third new browser. So they use the default as the only thing they use to search for anything. So Google realized this and is willing to pay billions of dollars to Apple to maintain this. I wouldn't say monopoly, but I would say this to take advantage to leverage this default bias of consumers.
It's interesting. And now coming on to a question that's very important for all the students. Is there any advice that you'd like to give them to pursue or any skill sets that they should go with in order to succeed in their career path in the future?
There are a few. So the first one, the lowest hanging fruit that we kind of touch on upon, is attention, right? So these days, most of your peers are attention deficit, not as a medical or clinical condition, but because of external stimuli, mostly social media, all these advertisers trying to grab your attention, right? So you have doom scrolling. You just scroll the phone for 5 minutes, take a break. Next thing you know, you wasted an. So one thing that I encourage students to think and do is to set goals and even lock your phone. There's apps that you can use to lock your phone for like 3, 4, 5 hours, right? I find doing that to be very productive. So typically, I don't sleep with my phone in my bedroom. I put it, in the living room, so that when I wake up, the first thing I do is not to check my phone, check my messages, but the first thing I do is to brush my teeth, right? And that saved 30 minutes of my day immediately. And you can think about that 30 minutes of exercising, doing other things that's more productive. So certainly that's one very easy tip that I typically do, and I encourage everyone to adopt that. That's one thing. The other thing that we spoke on casually before this call is that there are really hot industry these days, like AI, for example. Sustainability is a close second that everyone's pursuing, right? But there are other boring older industry that's not very sexy. However, they're still doing very, very well. So those industry, I really encourage students to think very carefully about those industry. Some time ago, we have a guest speaker who is in manufacturing, and then he just talked about how hard it is to recruit talent despite paying a very good compensation package. So students in their 20s, when they go to Google the office, they see the pool table, they got attracted by that. I want students to think about it more broadly, that there's more the technology industry, there are many industries out there that pays very well, that might be underexplored and certainly not as competitive compared to technology industry. And the last thing I would say is to think about what you're very good at, what you're very good at. So there are industries that valued performers, even though you're not the top performers. Take the extreme example. If you really like to play basketball, again, going back to the sports industry, if you're the top 1% basketball player in the world, at 25, you'll be unemployed. In contrast, if you're the top 10% of accountant, you're 25, you get a job at the Big Four. So you got to think about what you're good at, how big the industry is, whether you can actually crack in the industry. So these are things that I typically think about. tells you on an informal basis. First, to make sure that your attention is, at full capacity. Don't let the social media devices, don't let them to distract you. Again, they set a default for you, which is you wake up, look at your phone for 30 minutes or even more. That's really bad. Second thing, don't just think about a sexy, trendy industry like AI sustainability. Certainly, if you have options, pursue those. But there are many other options that are less sexy, but they still pay the bills. And the third is to think about what you're good at and how big or how small the industry is. You can be very good at something, but the industry is really, really small, like sports, for example, as an extreme example, but you get the point. That's not very good to pursue. Boring industry typically way larger. You can be just mediocre, slightly above average, still make a good living.
That's interesting. And you even brought the concept of how the Google makes the environment, the work-friendly environment. And do you think there's a psychological thing that goes behind creating such kind of environment that makes the employer come in and work regardless of the timings?
Yeah, so as far as I know, I'm not aware of any research that look into this office-based design in a very rigorous way. But the general idea is that of these offices is that if you design the office in an attractive way, people come into work, they work longer hours. These common spaces, cafeteria, pool table, that encourage more colleagues to have informal exchanges, and that lead to creativity and innovation that you otherwise would not get through formal meetings. So I think by and large, there should be a positive effect. However, I want to caution against that. So far as I'm aware, I don't see any academic research looking at this office spaces. Presumably because it's really hard to rule out an explanation. So most of the offices typically are by tech company in California and Silicon Valley. And if you work in other industry, you don't really see those investment per se. So it could be an industry specific thing, or it could be a more generalizable trend. We just don't know for sure.
That's interesting. Actually, I had a design thinking class, and in which professor mentioned about this working environment that impacts your creativity. And there
Uh-huh.
were two firms like IDEO, that's a big a name in itself, which works on creativity and gives consultancy. And there's another one called Jump Consultancy, which completely changed its environment so that they could get creative ideas and have more verbal exchanges with their employees. So very similar to thing that you mentioned right now.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And lastly, I don't want to end this podcast, but on a good note, I want to end it. So I want any book recommendation that you can give to the people, which they can read and which would help them in decision making. You mentioned about Economics, for sure. That's a good book. But is there any other books or any business review paper that one should go through?
Yeah. So recently I read two books that I think are very interesting to me personally. So the first, I'm looking at it in my shelf right now. I don't remember the exact title. So it's called After the Spike. So it is a book on population boom and how do we think about population boom in the past and how do you think about the declining birth rate that's happening around the world. So very insightful book by two economists at UT Austin that talk about how people typically think about the birth rate in a way that is not very intuitive. So this is one recommendation. The other one I'm looking at is a more recent book published, I think, just 2 months ago by Steve Pinker at Harvard. He's a psychologist. He is very famous for researching and speaking on this common knowledge problem. The name of the book is a mouthful. Is When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows, and then dot 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 dot. So the whole book is about private knowledge versus common knowledge, right? So the book basically talks about if I know something in private, you know the same thing in private, but it's not like common knowledge, that's really hard for us to coordinate. So one example that is very relevant in Southeast Asia, especially these days, in the past few months, we have a lot of protests, right? One of the reasons these protests become really viral and successfully, took down some government in Southeast Asia is precisely because of social media platforms that enable every single person to know where to gather, to know who else is also displeased with the government. So I might be very unhappy with the government. You might be as well. Privately, we know this, but I don't know what you know, and you don't know what I know. This media platform, social media platform, excuse me, made this knowledge common and public, and then really rally people to go out the street, which is one reason why many authoritarian government is very, very big on censorship, especially the online media space.
Never thought of this view of how social media is impacting using this information of incomplete information. I guess this terminology is even used in game theory, where incomplete information is used between two players when they are interacting in a game, and it's used in strategizing as well.
So certainly, social media is a tricky thing because it has positive features, like I said, rallying people going to the street to protest against a government that doesn't have the best interest of people in mind. That's a great feature. On the other hand, individually, it robs our attention, trying to sell us things that we don't need. That's certainly bad. How to regulate it? To what extent should we regulate it? The legality of it, I think, it remains to be seen. But I think now people are seeing social media as a double-edged sword, and the negativity seems to be getting bigger and bigger. That might even outweigh the positive features of it, at least initially. If you think about it, 25 years ago, when Facebook just started, everyone loved it, myself included. We find friends that we have lost contact for like 5, 6, 7 years. These days, you go on Facebook, people are not active anymore, right? Algorithms pushing videos and ads to you more than seeing actual authentic people posting about their media and their photos and pictures. Some even joke that now social media is anti-social, right? By spending 2, 3 hours a day on social media, you're being anti-social in reality. So I think it remains to be seen what goes on in this market, but I do think that it's a double-edged sword, but the negativity seems to be getting bigger and bigger.
Thank you so much. It was really great conversation with you, and thank you for sharing your perspective with all of us, and thank you for sparing out time. It was really thank you so much, Professor.
It's my pleasure.
Great
Thank you
talking
for
to you.
having me.